Some of you haven't been here since we've been in this series, so I'm just going to touch just for 5 minutes upon where we are in this. We're actually trying to get to the book of Joshua. But in the meantime, we are doing a little bit of a biographical study of the man Joshua. And we are looking for the clues in the books before we get to Joshua about where he is mentioned. And we're looking at this through the lens of how God is preparing him, teaching him about leadership. And so far, today we're going to be looking at the things that, as he has now been mentioned, earlier he was mentioned as the servant, the attendant to Moses himself. And we saw back last week and the week before that from Exodus chapter 32 about how he was exposed to some very disappointing activity. The people failed the Lord and at the base of the mountain. And but today we're going to see him still in this role. But let me go back. So we saw, first of all, kind of chronologically, he's not mentioned, but we know that he was in Egypt. He was born there. His father's name was Nun, but we don't have any details about his family except his father's name. But we know that his earliest memories were the discouraging and hopeless situation of being raised in a family that had to look forward to nothing but being absolute hard-driven slaves. All of his relatives, all of his neighbors, everybody was in servitude in Egypt, and it looked hopeless. That was his earliest days. He had no future really to think about, except he did know of this promise. And then we saw that a little bit of the fact in his family that either he had a father that died while in Egypt, we just don't know, or his father may have gone when they were after the 10 plagues and under Moses' leadership when they left and went into the land. The thing that if his father was alive, his father was evidently a failure in the sense that he did not support his son when his son was one of the spies that went into the land, and he disobeyed God. So his father's nothing noted about his father. So it could be encouraging for people who say, I don't come from a great Christian heritage. I don't have that kind of a background, so I'm going to be disadvantaged in serving the Lord. That is just not the case. The Lord can use people no matter what their background if they'll just love and serve him and be available. And then we saw that Joshua, one of the first big things that he did was there was a kind of a low-down, cowardly way of attacking, but they were at Rephidim, and there was this sort of distant relatives of Esau. They're the twin to Jacob, whose name later was changed to Israel. And this guy with his family, his soldiers, they would come in and attack the weak and the disadvantaged at the back of the camp. And Joshua was commissioned then, that was his first big assignment, was to gather men to go fight against the Amalekites, and they defeated them. And I think the lesson that he learned on that was it's dependent upon the Lord. Whenever Moses was praying for them and looking to the Lord, they prevailed. Whenever he relaxed that, then they were losing. And they prevailed that day simply because God gave them that victory. And then we've been looking at Joshua, the servant student. It was there in Exodus that we discovered that he was actually chosen to be a personal attendant or servant to Moses. And this happened when he was still relatively young. But he was able to go up on the mountain, for instance, and experience the things there. Maybe he wasn't right with Moses, but he was not in the camp. He was given some unusual opportunities as Moses' servant, and saw some unusual things. And I believe all of this God was using, as he does today with people, experiences that you might look at as being negative, but the Lord uses everything for his glory, and it prepares us. You might even look back in your own life with hindsight and see some of that. Now today, we're going to, the next time that he is mentioned is in the book of Numbers, and verses 11 and or chapters 11 and 12. In chapter 11, verse 28, and we're gonna get there in context, but in verse 28 of Numbers 11, it says, "Then Joshua the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses, from his youth," so that gives us a clue we did not have before, that he started serving in Moses' household and serving next to Moses in various menial tasks potentially, but that he started from his youth. And he sees something that we're going to discover here this morning, I trust. And he is kind of jealous, really, and wants Moses to step in and keep these people from doing something. But he's been seeing this. This tells us, the point of me pointing this out is this. This tells us that what we are about to read in the context of chapters 11 and 12, Joshua was there and seeing this. And you know what these two chapters are in all of the Bible? These are probably the most complaining and discouraging situations that happened one right after another of people, God's people, ignoring the faithfulness of the Lord in the past. And they are just one situation following another, 5 of them, where they are a complaining nation. Now, it may not have been everybody, but it was pretty significant. Some of these are very disappointing. For instance, Moses is 2 of them. Moses himself, a complainer. Joshua witnessed his own leader Moses failing in this regard. And family to Moses. We're going to see this, I trust, as we skim through this passage. But what does this have to do with us? Well, there's 2 things. First of all, I've mentioned. I believe that what our church, our town, our nation, our world needs is godly leaders. And you may not see yourself in a leadership role. But in a sense, the Great Commission says that everybody is to be a discipler, which is a leader. And so we need to see how the Lord can use us. You might be a young person, a student, or a child. You might be up in years and you've already checked out on that. You said, you know, I'm in the twilight of my life. My best years are over. I'm just gonna kind of make it through. That's not right. You need to be available day by day until the Lord takes you home to be able to serve Him in whatever way that He enables you to serve. And we need to look at situations that come up in our life. Turn with me, please, to the verses that are kind of the background for all of these this study of the children of Israel and the lessons we learn from them. Look at 1 Corinthians, please, chapter 10. This is the biblical support for why this is in the Bible and what you and I get from these kind of situations that are historically accurate and recorded for us. So let's be careful that we don't look at this with criticism of, oh, you foolish people back then. we need to see this as a warning and preparing us. We see this in the human nature. That's our nature, and we need to be prepared. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I want to begin at verse 1. We'll read down through verse 12. And Paul is writing to this very carnal church, and he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Now, that word baptized here, don't think of, dunking people in water. That's identification. That's the primary idea when the Bible talks about baptism in the Old or New Testament. It's commitment and identification with something. They were identified with Moses and the deliverance of God for his people. And they all ate the same spiritual food. We're going to read about that today. What was it called? Manna. And they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. That's interesting, because this is stating in no uncertain terms that Christ before Bethlehem, the pre-incarnate eternal Christ, was accompanying them through this wilderness situation. That's fascinating. And then it says, nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now, these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. And he gets specific. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, and that's ours today, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example. This is repeated from earlier in the text that we just read. They happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed. Be careful that he does not fall. Now, let me give you a little context of the timing of this. In the last lessons that we saw, let me just mention, we're going to be looking at lesson number 4 today, but our text last time was Exodus 32 verses 1 through 35, and these were the lessons that we picked up from that. Now we're going to be in Numbers 11 through 12, and you can turn there, and you're already probably discouraged thinking that we're going to be here all day. Pastor Tom dealing with 2 chapters, this is crazy. But I'm going to just kind of skim through it and hit the 5 complaints. But let me just give you a little bit of, here's the lesson. This chapter, these 2 chapters in all of the, maybe all of the Bible, but certainly with the nation of Israel, has more, the Spirit of God gave us this to show us the nature of our hearts as people, of being dissatisfied, discontent with our circumstances, and ultimately insulting and not trusting in God, and being complainers and rebellious in the way that we trust God or don't trust God. Now, let me just set this up for you. So back in Exodus 19, Moses gives us some timing detail. Exodus 19:1, it says, in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. So that tells us from in the 3rd month, it took them that long to get to the place in Sinai where God was going to say, okay, now make camp and get ready, because here is where I'm going to lay it all out for you. I'm going to turn you from a bunch of escaped slaves I'm going to convert you into my people, my nation. I'm going to give you my laws, the ordinance that will govern your relationships as people. It's going to be the only time in history that God is going to set a people up. He's going to be the governor. He's going to be the one to say, here's how it works the best. By the way, our nation in its earliest days looked to what God did with Israel, and our laws and our system of justice and so many things are patterned after this information. And that is one of the reasons why we are a blessed nation, or have been. We are starting to disregard that. You've seen in your lifetime, our nation began to disregard and push away. We don't even want the Ten Commandments displayed in our courtroom. We don't want them displayed in any government facility. I'm getting off the topic. Okay, so from the time the calendar starts for Israel, when they leave Egypt, they get to the mountain where God constitutes them with the laws and all the ordinances. He does so much more than that. They get there on about the third month, 3 months that they get there. They're there for approximately 11 months. And we get that because in Numbers chapter 10, verse 11, says, now in the second year, in the second month, so it's 11, on the 20th of the month, the cloud was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony. And that meant that God, when that cloud, pillar of cloud by day, a cloud by day and fire by night, when that cloud lifted, it was time for them to break camp and follow where God was leading them. So they were there for about a year. And what happened in that time? Well, they got the law. They, of course, had the stupid rebellion there around with the golden calf and Aaron and all that stuff that we saw last time. And but then they were punished for that. The people that especially got out of line, a lot of them died or were killed. And then Moses was able to, from God's instruction that he got on the mountain, he was able to tell them, okay, here's how God says we're to worship him. We're supposed to build this particular structure, this temporary movable structure called the tent of meeting or tabernacle, that has very illustrative furniture and the layout and everything. That's a whole nother study. It's fascinating about the tabernacle or the temple later on. And this is how we're going to have full-time people, the Levites, sons and descendants of Aaron, are going to be the priests and the teachers and the ones that are going to, it's a theocracy, not a democracy. It's a God-ruled nation. First one. And all of that, the clothes they were to wear, how they were to be compensated, all of those details of the worship life of the nation are detailed in this 11-month period. They built the tabernacle. They set up the priests and Levites. And they are all trained and equipped. And then it's time to move on. God says, okay, let's keep going toward the land I'm going to give you. And so they move ahead. We are now, at the end of chapter 10, we are now in that mindset. The people have mobilized. They've begun to leave Mount Sinai. And here, this is the Sinai Peninsula. And I'm going to give you some things. So here, here is where, this is called the Wilderness of Sin. And then they have, down here is in the vicinity. Some of this, by the way, is not definite. There's different ideas as to where Mount Sinai really was. But this is this is a very likely inside the second circle, very likely the area. And the red line that goes from the upper left down like a V down to that circle and then back up, that is probably the route that the nation was taking. And then they get to this area called the wilderness of Paran. And some of this is going to be happening there. And they're ultimately, next time we are in this, they're going to be up here at the bottom border, the southern border of the promised land. And they're going to be poised. Didn't happen, but they're going to be poised and ready to trust God and move into the promised land and possess it as they have been promised to be able to do. It didn't happen. We'll save that for later. But I'm just giving you the time and the places of where this complaining all takes place. So let's look at the complaints themselves. In chapter 11, we don't have a specific on this one. I'm going to be simply quoting what it says. It says, the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. So this started somewhere probably small and began to penetrate the camp of Israel, the nation of Israel, as complainers. Isn't it interesting how our nature is? We pick up on the negative so much faster than we do the encouraging. It's just weird the way that is, but that's what was starting to happen. We don't know exactly what they were complaining about, but we do know a couple things. We know that, first of all, the Lord heard it, and the Lord severely judged it. Look at the rest of the verse. They began to complain in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. So a literal fire started on the perimeter, and it was hurting and killing people as a response to their complaining, their general complaining. Here's the complaint. General complaining, if you're filling in the outline. So, how did it end? Well, the people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. We've got some firefighters or former firefighters that are here. Sorry, I don't know that there was any firefighters involved in this one being put out. The Lord just said, okay, I'm going to answer Moses' prayer, and I'm going to stop the fire. They named the place, so the name of that place was called Taberah because of the fire, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now, you would think that that was pretty instructive. You'd think that they go, okay, we got it, but that didn't work. So then there was a second, and these are in kind of quick sequence. The second one takes place here in chapter 11, verse 4. And and now we have a little bit more detail. This comes from what this translation refers to as the rabble. It says, the rabble who were among them had greedy desires, but it didn't stop with this. Well, I'll explain who the rabble is. It didn't stop with those folks. Look at what it goes on to say. And also the sons of Israel wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? Now the rabble refers to people who were not descendants of Abraham, but they had joined the nation of Israel when they were leaving Egypt. Some of them could have been Egyptians, and they were impressed with the plagues and the demonstration of Almighty God in the way that the Israelites were delivered under Moses' leadership. And they might have said, your God is more powerful than our God. I think we'll go with you guys. It doesn't mean that they had really converted and honored the God of heaven, but they had accompanied them, and they were welcome to accompany them. But they often caused trouble in the camp. And this is a good example of that. Their complaint was, who will give us meat to eat? Now, I'm not a vegetarian. In fact, I might make jokes about vegetarians. But this is a complaint really against God. Because back in Exodus chapter 16, they had enjoyed a never before provided sustenance, a nutritional thing, this manna. And you can read about it. It's really quite an amazing thing. You know, this comes from MacArthur's book on Exodus and Numbers, the Exodus from Egypt. It says the Israelites had been traveling through the wilderness for about a year. During that time, they had again and again witnessed the Lord's immense power and miraculous intervention. One miracle in particular had taken place that entire time. Each morning, the Lord rained down a unique wafer-like substance called manna. It was nutritious and tasty, direct from the Lord Himself. This wonder was profound. The food was so nourishing that the people did not need to eat anything else. It's completely balanced, completely nourishing. It didn't up their cholesterol. It tasted good. It was perfect. And they never got hungry. It tasted good. It said it was like wafers made with honey. And they did not need to go out and hunt for it. It was the first delivered to your doorstep food service. Really. All the people had to do was merely step outside their tent and start picking it up off the ground every day, a fresh supply. The only exception was on the Sabbath, and it was a miraculous thing because if you tried to keep on any other day, if you tried to take and collect and said, you know what, I've got more than I can eat here, I'm going to just be able to take a vacation from going out in the morning tomorrow, I'm going to just hang on to it, you'd wake up and ew, it was all rancid and wormy and you'd want to throw it out. You were to gather what you could eat for that day. Reminds me of the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread, right? The Lord promises, I'll take care of you, but on a daily basis. And so they just stepped outside and they would deliver it right by their tent. And it was always more than enough. There was never a shortage. There was never a trucker strike. There was never, empty shelves or anything like that. The entire nation, and we're going to, by the way, in our text today, we are going to get the clue as to the size of this assembly. All they had to do was just go out and get it. And then you didn't have to deal with leftovers because it would melt away. It was a great thing. There was so much of God's love in the manna that it was hard to believe anyone would have complained about it. And yet, when we come to this passage today, that's exactly what the people did. They had had the same thing every day since before they got to Mount Sinai. And they were sick and tired of it. Now, the passage back there tells us that even in this one, it says a little bit of a description of it. The people, verse 8, would go about and gather it and grind it between 2 millstones, or beat it in the mortar, or boil it in the pot and make cakes with it, and taste was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. So in other words, even though it was the same kind of thing, they were creative, and they would work with it and had different recipes. I think Pinterest had a whole bunch of different manna recipes on how to work with this stuff. My dad preaching on this, I'll never forget this. I was a kid, and Dad was preaching on this, and he said they had manna pizza, they had manna ravioli. He said he was talking about, they were working with this and working, to make it a little bit of a variety. But now, the second complaint, they are rejecting it. We are not happy with this anymore. And so this is the complaint. Man is boring. We want meat. We want meat. It's interesting how the Lord dealt with this, but before we get to the answer of how He dealt with this complaint, we come to the third complaint. And I am so sad that the Bible always is true. Here we have in verses 10 through 15, Moses, the man of God, the servant of the Lord, he's getting kind of tired of these people. Look at what it says. Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families. Hey, listen. This is how complaining it was. Can't you just see these crybabies? I don't like this anymore. And he's walking through the camp and he's seeing all this and he is disgusted. You are disregarding and dishonoring God with this. Each man at the doorway of his tent. The anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. See, it's not about the diet. It's about receiving gratefully what God in His wisdom and sovereign grace is providing. You know, discontentment is not godly, ever. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you been so hard on your servant?" He's talking to God here. "And why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all this people on me?" Can you see here what's going on? He's not trusting God either. And he's complaining to God, saying, you know, I'm kind of outnumbered here. There's a lot of people, and all of it comes back to me. And he's starting to have a pity party. He goes on in verse 12, "Was it I who conceived all this people? Was it I who brought them forth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which you swore to their fathers?" And then he says, "And where am I to get meat to give to all this people?" Here's the second complaint. The second aspect of this. Where's this meat going to come from? "For they weep before me, saying, give us meat that we may eat." Hey, that rhymes. "I alone am not able to carry all this people because it is too burdensome for me." So he's talking to God. He says, if you are going to deal thus with me, look at this, verse 15. "Please kill me at once if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness." How disappointing. Again, I want to just remind you, we're tracking through the eyes of Joshua. This guy who had not maybe seen this ever before in Moses, now he is seeing Moses actually have an attitude of complaining to God. Why have you put me into this position of leading these kind of crybaby people? And now you're going to come up with a provision of meat out here? Where are you going to find meat to feed this many people? And he's actually talking that way to God. Be careful. These people are too much of a burden. Now listen to me. Have you ever thought that you couldn't take any more? Under the circumstances, have you ever, whatever they might have been, thought, you know, God, why? Why are you doing this to me? I can't take it anymore. I know I'm asking a question that's obvious. I don't know of anybody that's not ever, from time to time, spoken to God that way. I can't go on. Lord. I just can't take it anymore. And I want to remind you, this verse I did not anticipate, I didn't think of it, but it just comes to mind right now. In the context of 1 Corinthians 10, when I read to you those 12 verses, there is, the next verse says, there is no trial or temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful. And here's a promise from a faithful God, who will not allow you to be tested beyond what you are what? Able. But will with that trial, test, temptation provide not a, but the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. That is a promise to hang on to. It is the faithfulness of God. And I'm telling you, at this point, Moses was failing. He said, these people are too much of a burden for me. I'm a pastor of a fine group of people, but as I look over your faces, without mentioning any specific thing, I know some of your circumstances are difficult. And I know that there are times, I hear it in your voice, that you feel like you are at the end of your endurance. And you plead with God, oh God, step in, change such and such, make this different. I just don't think we can go on. I'm going to just tell you, don't fail like Moses failed. God knows exactly what He's doing. He always does. Let's keep going before we look at how God dealt with these. The fourth complaint we read, and it was there where Moses says to God, where are we supposed to get all this meat for all these people? How is that going to work? And the complaint here was, God, you've done it this time. You have made too much of a promise. Now, this is ridiculous, people. Moses is trying to tell God he doesn't know what he's doing. You have failed to understand. God, I know better than you do what's going on here. There is no possible way that you can give meat to these people like they want. Not even one time, not just even for one meal. Wow. Moses. And I'm thinking, Joshua, this has got to be a hard thing for you to see this. You're watching Moses, the great man of God, who's done so many great things, and you're watching him say to God, I know better than you do about how to deal with this kind of a situation. I believe this was a very key time in Joshua's development to be able to see the failure of Moses, the humanity, and then to see how God was going to deal with it. Before we look at, let's go to the last one. For the last one, we go to chapter 12, and this is the whole chapter dealing with one complaint. It says in verse 1, Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite, or Ethiopian, some translations. He had married a Cushite woman. And this is their complaint. This is what they spoke against Moses. And they said, Has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has He not spoken through us as well? And of course, the Lord heard it. So the complaint is them saying, hey, what about us? You're not the only one that God speaks through. We're significant too. Now, I believe what we haven't covered back in chapter 11 helped make this complaint a complaint. Because if we go back, we see that first of all, the way that God dealt with Moses when he said, these people are too much of a burden for me. What God instructed him to do, and just for the sake of time, you can read, there's quite a few verses there that it would take us too much time this morning to go back in chapter 11 and to see all that. But what God essentially does is he says, Moses, I want you to take 70 mature men, elders of Israel, and I want you to gather them together, and come tomorrow morning, I want you to go out to the tent of meeting, all 70 of them. Now, I don't know if Moses, or if Aaron, of course, is Moses' brother, and Miriam is Moses' sister. I don't know if they tagged along. The text doesn't tell us. But what happened the next morning when Moses brought these other men together, men that he had evidently not really leaned upon, is that the Lord took, and listen carefully, Moses was only ever capable as a leader because of one thing. Because of the Spirit of God enabling him. That's it. Moses didn't know he wasn't eloquent in speech. He couldn't do any of those great miracles in Egypt or any of those things. He had always been capable for one reason, because of God's enablement of His Spirit through him. And he had left that out of his mind. He had forgotten that. So this morning, these 70 men, and they surround the tent of meeting. I believe that Joshua was probably there watching this off to the side. And I don't know if it was anything visible, like on the day of Pentecost, where there was some visible expression of the Spirit of God. I don't know. But we did have an open, visible demonstration. But the Spirit of God that had enabled Moses to be the leader that he was up to that point, God took that Spirit and He said, it doesn't diminish my capacity to spread that through these 70 men. And they were... Verse 25 of chapter 11, Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and He took of the Spirit who was upon him, Moses, and placed him, the Spirit, upon the 70 elders. And it came about that when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied. It says, but they did not do it again. This was a demonstration and a lesson to Moses that God's Spirit gets the credit. God gets the credit. It's not the man makes a difference. It's the Spirit of God through the man. And these 70 men, now prophesied here, it doesn't mean that they started telling what was going to happen that afternoon ahead of time. That's not the point. They began to demonstrate in their worship, in the words that they were speaking that were the truth. It was ministering, and they just, like without preparations, they began to speak things that were truly edifying to everybody that watched this. It was obvious to Moses. It was obvious to all the witnesses. This tent of meeting was at the center of the camp. And everybody watching this went, wow, look at that. And it could have been that Moses and Aaron, because they were not one of the 70 and because the Spirit of God had not come upon them, that they were jealous, said, what about us? We're family. How come we got left out of this demonstration? But that's not what they said. The first verse of their complaint was because of the Cushite woman which he had married. There was other things going on. There was internal family struggles. And I know that none of you ever have got internal family issues. But isn't that amazing how some of the deepest hurts can come from the people closest to you? But the real issue was their jealousy. And it was critical of God, not of Moses. In fact, don't we see this in all 5 of the complaints? Who is it really against? God. It's against God. When we complain in the home, on the job, in the church, wherever, it's always, note it, it's always a complaint against God. One way or another, it's against Him. Lord, you didn't provide, or you put this on me, or you allowed. All of them. So when Moses said, this is too much of a burden for me, God said, really? My spirit is incapable? I'll show you I can do this again and again. In fact, this is where we have this little side note where God makes a point and impresses something upon Joshua. It was in the time when these 70 men demonstrated very publicly in the center of the camp surrounding the tent of meeting that the Spirit of God, the same Spirit of God that had been with Moses, now also went with these 70 individuals, these elders of Israel. But there was also a couple of men that, in verse 26, 2 men that remained in the camp. They weren't called out. They weren't chosen by Moses to be one of the 70. They were just guys somewhere in that camp. And the name of the one was Eldad, and the name of the other was Medad, and the Spirit rested upon them. Now they were among those who had been registered, but had not gone out to the tent, and they prophesied. So the people, all of a sudden, the folks that were around them go, wow, the same thing that's happening with them, the Spirit of God here. And that, when that word got to Joshua, that's when he was jealous for Moses, said, they shouldn't be doing that. Reminds me of the disciples coming to Jesus and saying, these guys are casting out demons. These guys are doing something. And they want Jesus to say, stop it. Stop it. You're not in I didn't sanction this. I didn't give you my Messiah seal of approval. And what did Jesus say? He said, this is of God. This is not bad. So that's how God kind of dealt with that third complaint. It's not the burden, it's my spirit that's the solution to it's my provision. It's what I add to this situation, Moses. I can use one man or I can use many men. That's my choice. The fourth complaint, this one's almost hilarious. And this is where he's saying, hey, you've gone far beyond. There is not a Costco within we can't find enough meat to feed these people. Now, the text tells us that there had been about 600 men, adult men, 600,000 adult men, the text tells us. So if you, just conservatively, if you say that there were that many adult women, 600,000 plus 600,000 is? And then there's children. And the Israelites tended to be sort of like Utahns. And so that's why Bible scholars take that number and say, as hard to believe as it is that 2 million people would be sustained and working through that much wilderness area, but I'm just going with what the Bible says. But Moses is saying, Lord, that's 2 million people. Where are you going to get that kind of protein? Where are you going to get that kind of meat from? by the way, that's verse 21, where Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot. That was the men, and then you add to it. And he's complaining about that. Now, this fourth complaint is mentioned in verse 31. And let me just read it, and then I'll give you a little bit more. It says, chapter 11, verse 31. Now there went forth a wind from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep on the surface of the ground. There is a migration that still happens, but it doesn't normally happen in this fashion. There were some things that God, who is in charge of all things, including winds and currents and animals, and I mean, we've seen that in other stories in the Bible. He can command a worm to come up and do something. He can command a plant to come up and shield his prophet so that he can have the worm come up and kill the plant and make the prophet learn a lesson. He can command a great fish to come up and yawn just at the right time to receive a prophet that's being thrown over the side of the boat. God has that kind of absolute sovereign ability and control. So he just said to this massive migration of quail, okay, I'm going to send you on a little bit different route. I'm going to bring the wind from a different direction. Now, normally they flew higher, but in this case, they flew about 3 feet off the ground. And it was a massive amount. And the people went out, and the timing was like, what do you know? And they started, these birds are just flying like this. You just pap, hit them with anything, throw your cloak over them. The kids are grabbing quails, and the amount of meat was so excessive. I looked up some units of measure, and some of this is not precise, but do you know how big a 55-gallon drum is? Each person had the equivalent of about almost 2 55-gallon drums of quail meat. Now, I gotta ask, has anybody ever eaten quail? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now you're starting to raise your hand. It's not a bad thing. I have no idea. John, is it good? Okay, your wife says, eh. Okay. If you know how to cook it, okay. So the people, but if you read the account here, it says in verse 32, the people spent all day and all night and all the next day, in verse 32, and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. While the meat was still between their teeth, before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people. Here is a prime example. Now, I'm just telling you, that starts with a complaint against God, and God shows himself again after all that he has done to provide for them, and they are dishonoring God. But he provides again, but in such a way that it's part of the judgment. Do you know that sometimes what you might consider God blessing you is really God punishing you for what you inappropriately desired? A relationship that is out of the will of God. I can't tell you how many times I have talked with somebody and they said, Pastor, will you marry us? And I go, well, let's talk, because I got certain biblical guidelines to go by. And I come to find out that it's maybe a Christian gal or a Christian guy that's trying to marry a non-Christian. And they want it, and here's what they say. I prayed about it, and God wants, this is of the Lord. I'm saying, well, there's a problem here, because this is what it says is of the Lord, and it's not there. And many times that is a disaster. It says, while the meat was still between their teeth. So you can just see these people, they are so craving, lusting, beyond desire, this meat that they are catch it. They don't know which to do first. Catch more or start the barbecue. And they are just consuming it so much. It says, the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. They buried the people who were so greedy in the way they ate. So a lot of people died because of complaining to God. Finally, the complaint that we saw in the 5th complaint, which was from Miriam. Miriam, evidently, because she's named first in chapter 12 before her brother Aaron. Apparently, she's the one that really was leading or coming up with this objection and complaining, and Aaron goes along. Aaron seems to always go along with the wrong thing, you know. Men, come on, we've got to get backbone here. And so they come against this and they start bringing up the phony stuff before they get to the real stuff. But look, and I'm going to just skim this. Verse 3. After they had made their real complaint and the Lord had heard it, it says, now the man Moses was very humble, more than any man who was on the face of the earth. And I think that the word suddenly is kind of significant here in verse 4. Suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and to Miriam. I think it might have caused them to be startled. His voice just came out of nowhere as they were having this complaint session. And he says, you three come out of the tent of meeting. It reminds me of when a parent says to the kids, you and you and you, come here. Can't be good, folks. And then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood in the doorway of the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they had both come forward, I wonder how their body language was as they were coming forward. The Lord is there in this glory, and they come up. I don't think they were cocky. I don't think that you can do that in seeing the glorious awesomeness of the Lord. And he said, God said to them, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then are you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? Verse 9. So the anger of the Lord burned against them, and then he departed. I don't know how that would sound or feel, but I believe they knew when the Lord said that, and they somehow, when the way the Lord left, it was a terrible impression of, uh-oh. But when the cloud had withdrawn from over the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam. Behold, she was leprous. Instant advanced leprosy. And Aaron said to Moses, O my Lord, I beg you, do not account this sin to us in which we have acted foolishly and in which we have sinned. Do not let her be like one dead, whose flesh is half eaten away when she comes from the mother's womb. So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, O God, heal her, I pray. And look at the Lord's response. But the Lord said to Moses, if your father had but spit on her face, should she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut up for 7 days outside the camp. In other words, she's going to think about this. I'm not going to do something instantly. She's going to bear this for 7 days away from everybody because leprosy is super contagious. Separate her out there, leave her alone, let it sink in The Lord doesn't do well with people criticizing how and what He does. So Miriam was shut up outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until Miriam was received again. Afterward, however, the people moved out from Herioth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. Listen, we should take a couple things home with us from this. First of all, complaining comes easy for us, doesn't it? But it is never honoring to God. And no matter who you think the complaint is registered against, it ultimately is an offense to God. If you're complaining, teenagers, about your parents, guess who gave you those parents? If you're complaining against your mate, your husband or your wife, guess who put them in your life? And on it goes. If you're complaining against, this is one that I think we need to be really careful about. If you're complaining against a political party or political leaders, who put those people where they are? Answer me. God did. You don't have to agree with them, but pray for them. Pray for them. Honor God by praying for them. Complaining is rebellion. It's sin. And it never honors God. I don't know what you need to do with this today, but I think some of us need to make things right with God. The Lord hears it. And did you notice how many times in this? The Lord heard it, it says. And the Lord heard it. And the Lord heard it. Do you think the Lord hears it when you think it or say it? Yes, He does. Would you pray with me? Father, we want to learn alongside Joshua as he watches people around him complaining. Some of them are not Israelites. Some of them are former Egyptians, people that were just tagging along. Some of them were his countrymen complaining about the diet, how God had provided, and they didn't think it was right. But Lord, it must have been so impressive in a negative way when he saw Moses complaining to God about, God, you've put too much on me. This is too much of a burden. These people are too much. And then you've made promises about how you're going to supply meat. You can't do that. Lord, this is impossible. And as Joshua watched how the Lord easily brought so much meat right to the people, and then judged them for their greediness and their lack of control of themselves. And Lord, I'm so concerned today for each of us. We are so prone to complain. The Bible says that for those who have the Spirit of God in us, that we should be thankful people. Lord, help us. That's a decision to make. Help us to say, Lord, I don't know how this is going to work out, but I am so glad that you are God and you love me and you have promised to provide. And so, Lord, I thank you in advance for how you're going to work. Lord, but keep us, help us, remind us of the sin of complaining. Help us to be trained in leadership like Joshua. For it's in Jesus we pray. Amen.